South African students at tertiary institutions have owed around 16.25 billion rands in fees since 2020. This is a far cry from a seemingly minuscule 3.3 billion in 2011. One report says on average students carrying debt on graduation owe more than 30,000 rands each. It's a risk that has seen many abandon their studies but also leave institutions vulnerable, and we'll remember, of course, how it gave birth to the Fees Must Fall movement a few years ago. Joining us now to discuss the matter are Yandisa Nzoia, President of the South African Union of Students, Professor Chiridzi Marara, University of Johannesburg Vice Chancellor, and Ahmed Bauer, Chief Executive Officer at the University of South Africa. Gentlemen, good evening and thank you very much for your time and joining us tonight here on In Focus. Let us start with you, Mr. Bauer. You said, I mean, in one report last year, around March or so, when it was, of course, established that a 14 billion rand debt was what was being owed universities collectively in South Africa. You said that's a significant amount of money and cannot simply be wiped out. In fact, you said a new funding strategy would need to be devised here. Is there a new funding strategy at hand to deal with the debt crisis challenge?
Unfortunately, we don't have a solution yet. I mean, so this is very much a problem that still exists, and basically, the solution to this isn't going to be found from the students who can't afford to pay, and it can't be found from the universities, which are simply not in a position to wipe out these debts. So really, there really does need to be a national solution to this to facilitate, the ability of students to pay these debts, perhaps through a loan system, working with the banks or something like that.
Yeah.
But this is something that is of deep concern to the university system, largely because, this is very much a part of the university budgets. It's not something on top of the budgets, if you like. It's built into university budgets. And so it's something that we have to work towards in addressing the future sustainability of higher education and the challenge that this presents to, in particular, to students who fall outside of the DSFAS threshold, if you like, of 350,000 rand per year in annual income, family annual income.
Do students accept that particular matter, that this debt can't just simply be erased? Or is there an expectation from students that at least either universities or somewhere government need to make a concession and say, well, we'll forego this debt so that you can continue and get your academic qualification?
Thank you very much. I think, first of all, you must give a recognition that there are three problems that contribute largely to the debt of students. Number one, the fee increment that is constantly being raised by universities is one of the crises that we are facing, because it then means that the funding that is available from government is going to be very minimal in terms of funding students that want to be admitted. It can be that when we want to achieve free education, universities are increasing fees. That's the first crisis. The second crisis, the funding structure that has been set by government to fund students, poor students. For an example, there is a crisis where you find that students who are admitted in a diploma qualification, they are not funded for a BTech or their advanced diploma. Now you find them in a crisis where they can't cross that bridge in them going to honors so that they can access that NRF funding. So they are left with a debt, those students. The third crisis that we have is the missing middle that we need to respond to. Students who find that they are not within the NSFAS bracket, but yet they are not affording to pay for their fees because of the expenses that their parents are paying. Now, we must be realistic to say that if we, let's say, employ a tactic of saying we use a loan system, there is high unemployment rate in South Africa. How do you expect people to pay a loan when they are not working? Two, how do we make sure that NRF is sufficient enough to fund all students who want to advance to postgrad so that we don't leave students with a debt that they can't pay? And we've been raising this with government to say that it does not make any logical sense to study when you're not going to get your qualification so that you go and work as an employee and enter the labor market. So the debt crisis needs to be resolved with immediate effect. It's one of the issues that we will be tackling this year as the union very hard in making sure that no student is locked outside. Either they want to continue studies or they want to get their qualifications. We are investing time in that as a union to make sure that is resolved.
Yeah. Professor Barala, I'll get you to respond to those issues of free increment funding structure and so on and so forth. But the first question that I would want you to address from an academic point of view, borrowing for postgraduate education, does it yield any significant benefit? And is there any sort of literature to support that?
No, absolutely. I mean, look, more education is always good. So I will encourage people to pursue higher education. It is important. But coming to the issues that have been raised, Luabalo has raised very, very important issues. But there is one issue that is missing. For example, here at the University of Johannesburg, our outstanding debt is 575 million. And of that 575 million, 330 million is for people who have dropped out. So the issue that needs to be sorted out is how do we make sure that our students actually succeed? Because if they succeed, the people who are falling off the system are not necessarily even the NSFAS students who are funded are falling out of the system because if they drop courses and they repeat years, they start accumulating debt. So the issue of making sure that we put mechanisms into place. Here at the University of Johannesburg, we have an extensive tutorial system, specifically to deal with the issue of success rate, so that we can be able to get the people to actually pass.
Yeah.
Now, the second issue is all of us as leaders of the university, we have to go out there and raise money for the missing middle students. It is clear that government will not have all the answers to the crisis in funding of higher education, and it also goes to the crisis of infrastructure. For example, here at the University of Johannesburg, we raised 179 million this year, last year, the year of the COVID, just to deal with those people who are not poor enough to be able to qualify for NSFAS, but they are also not rich enough to be able to afford paying for themselves. So, and all this has to be done by all of us as leaders of higher education institutions, as government, as the private sector must also come to the party to make sure that we deal with the issue of education. Because education is actually an investment. There is no economic future of South Africa unless we educate our people and we educate them well and they complete their qualifications on time. And we have to support them in order for them to achieve that.
Yeah. So, Bawa, what concessions are universities willing to make at this particular point? I mean, previously you had said you will allow students with debt to continue studying. Is that something that is still there? Is that something that is still ongoing? As Yandisa is saying, to say, well, I mean, if I'm going to study and not be able to get the qualification, it's really pointless because then I can't go anywhere and apply anywhere and actually begin to be economically active.
No, absolutely. I mean, if I were to speak from the University of Johannesburg, we have mechanisms of making sure that people who are in good academic standing, meaning that they are passing all their courses, that they are assisted, whether through our internal scholarships, whether through our acknowledgement of debt mechanism where we allow them to continue. So we make sure that no student is left behind, especially a student who is doing well and a student who is serious about their qualifications. But again, this is the issue that we all have to put our head together so that we can be able to tackle this issue of
All right,
making sure that people come and study.
Let's take a break. When we come back, Ahmed, I'll get you to weigh in on that as well. Chief Executive Officer of Universities South Africa. We also have Professor Chidizi Marala, University of Johannesburg's Vice Chancellor, and we have the President of the South African Union of Students, Yandisa Nzoia. Conversation on the student debt crisis. Yandisa Nzoia, President of the South African Union of Students, Professor Chidizi Marala, University of Johannesburg's Vice Chancellor, and Ahmed Bauer, Chief Executive Officer of the Universities South Africa. Ahmed, everything rises. Everything is even more expensive now, having, of course, gone through this moment of a pandemic and businesses shutting down, economies not doing well. But also the cost of education continues to rise. Yandis are saying one of the issues is, of course, the increases that are continuing to be put on. Now, typically, of course, student fees or university fees are made up of fees per module. Is there a way that instead of the curve of the price or the cost going up, it can actually go down?
Yeah, the fee increases basically over the last 5, 6, 7 years has been no more than the inflation rate. And the bottom line is that if university fee increases are less than the inflation rate, what it means basically is that there's a decline in the budgets of the universities, which means essentially that there'll be less money for staffing, there'll be less money for infrastructure, there'll be less money for operating costs and so on. So the increases have been fixed at inflation rates, and this year it's 5%, which is what the inflation rate is. So there hasn't been beyond inflation rate linked increase over the last 6, 7, 8 years, in fact. So that's the first point, I think. The second point is that the inflation rate, by the way, isn't the right measure to measure the rate of expansion in the cost of higher education. And the reason for that is because so much of the expenditure of universities depends on other, either importation of goods, the payment for journals and so on, which are dollar linked. So as the rand kind of changes in value against the dollar and against the pound and against the euro in particular, what that means is that the value of the rand, of course, is declining. And that means that the cost in rand terms for the universities is also increasing at a rate that's beyond inflation.
Yeah.
So I think that it's important for us to understand that at the very minimum, just to keep the level of funding from tuition fees at a level playing field, the linking that to 5% inflation rate is not an increase. It's just to keep up with the expansion.
I guess what I'm asking is the capacity that exists within universities, for example, to counter that kind of effect where we are reliant on the rand-dollar exchange?
Yeah, it's very difficult to do that because so much of the research equipment, so much of our journal purchases, which are vital to the research enterprise, so much of that comes from it's not from South Africa. It's not produced in South Africa. It's produced elsewhere. Now, of course, there are things that universities have taken on to address that kind of increase. So there's a lot of software development taking place now within South Africa, which is rand linked rather than dollar linked. So that's very good. And there are other other initiatives that universities have embarked on, which allow us to kind of really try and avoid that rand-dollar link, if you like. But there are some things that we just can't avoid because we are tied to the international higher education system, the international global knowledge system, if you like. So it's important for us to understand that the inflation rate is not a fair measure of what the rise in the cost of higher education is.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, I just want to raise two other issues that Lubabalo raised, which I think are really important. Of course, I mean the issue of postgraduate funding is a critical one. I mean, I think that it's not right. I think to have students it's just simply not right. I mean, to have students who have received NSFAS funding have obtained their first degrees, qualify to be in a postgraduate program, and then can't proceed because there isn't a funding mechanism for them. And it's not clear to me that should be the NRF, but there should be some funding system for postgraduate students. I mean, so that's clear to me at least. And the important thing about that, by the way, is that the unemployment rate of graduates, of postgraduates, is way below the unemployment rate of graduates, which is already much, much lower than the unemployment rate of non-graduates. So it makes good sense. It's a good investment for us to really invest in postgraduate education, it seems to me. And I think that that's something that we've been arguing, the students have been arguing, and so on. But there is a second point here. The second point is that the economy needs, our economy, we are moving towards we want to be a kind of a knowledge-based economy and so on. Well, we need postgraduates for that. It's as simple as that. And then finally, just a last point I want to take up. All 26 universities have always kind of found ways of addressing the debt issue, if you like. And by the way, none of the universities hold back. They might hold back certificates, from students, but they don't hold back the qualifications. Once students have graduated, then they receive letters. The employers receive letters, whatever the case might be. So no student is held back. The question for me is, and it's a big question, is what pressure are we bringing to bear on young people who are not able to afford higher education? And that's a very big issue, because you can't expect students to perform at a decent level if they are, running around, scurrying around, trying to find out how to raise money for their studies.
Yeah.
And that's we need a national solution to this. I mean, it's as simple as that.
Yandisa, what is, my question for you, what is a national solution that comes from the students themselves, except for the question of saying we're going to put pressure on government this year, we're going to put pressure on universities this year? What other proposals are in place, for example, to improve our capacity within our own country to be able to address this question and be able to offer education at a rate that we can afford, I suppose, if you're talking in rand terms?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think the arguments that are brought by Prof. Marwala and Prof. Pao are very important. The first point that you must bring into it is this: institutions of higher learning, as institutions, they have no responsibility of being profit-driven. That's not their purpose. They are not supposed to be profit-driven. But the fair point to be made is to say that at least you must make sure that they are sustainable. They are not collapsing. They are financially sound, they are not collapsing. But it does not make sense when an institution is growing in terms of the reserves, but there are more students that are being excluded. Then it shows that there is a crisis within that institution, and the institution is actually misunderstanding the point that it is supposed to be doing in society. Number two, what is happening now as a crisis that it's a discussion that we have started now as the union, to say that how is it that when you go to VETs, they are able to admit more than 400 public management students, but they admit less than 100 pharmacy students? And are we really responding to the challenges of society, and are we really responding to the needs of young people out there? And why is it that Prof. Pao is saying it himself, that educated people, those who just graduated the undergrad, are less unemployed than those who are not educated, and those who did postgrad are less unemployed than those who did not do postgrad? But yet universities are giving us a very difficult process when it comes to widening access for students that want to start, meaning that then we are not really responding to the crisis. Now, the first point that we brought is to say that South Africa needs a single coordinated education system, where there are no universities that behaves like last bonds of the sector, where they just do things that are outside the plan of the sector, and they're not responding necessarily to the challenges of young people in society. Number two, we need a leveled education system in terms of funding model that is going to be able to respond to all the requirements. For an example now, just to bring an example, young people that are doing qualifications like PhD and PGCE are the ones that are finding employment. But yet, government is refusing to fund PTCE, yet they are funding management, they are funding marketing, qualifications that are not producing jobs, meaning that we are missing a point here, and now we need to change that. Also, we're saying that institutions should not raise fees to an extent that they want to make profit out of it. And for every fee, for every percent that an institution must increase, it must be covered by that government gap funding.
Right.
And the other culprit that you have not been paying attention to is the private sector, because with an educated labor force, they stand to benefit highly as a private sector in terms of expanding their companies. And yet they are investing very little in terms of making sure that our education system is well funded. So there must be a decision taken by government in dealing with private sector. And the other stakeholder that we normally miss when we're engaging about higher education is the treasurer, because we find that we fight amongst the Department of Education with USAF and other stakeholders and forget the people that actually do the allocation of funding in terms of education. I mean, it does not make sense for any developing state to cut budget of education. I mean, you can go anywhere. For a developing state that cuts budget of education and cuts budget of health, what is it that actually you are planning? So there are three things, Prof. Power, that you are raising. To say that students are not denied their qualifications. For an example, I'm one of those students. I'm sitting here, Prof. Marola, I was thinking of enrolling in an institution, but I have a crisis of my qualification that I can't get. And imagine the feeling, Prof. Bao, when you study for 4 years and you get a cum laude. When you graduate, instead of getting your qualification, when you enter inside, its return results will help for both based on financial reasons. Now, students can't go out there and apply for jobs. There are those who already have their qualifications.
Yeah.
When you apply, you are told by a company, bring your qualifications. You must still email the university, whilst there are students who are producing their qualifications.
Unfortunately, I am completely out of time, so I'm going to have to leave it there. But let me thank you all for coming on, Prof. Power, Professor Chilidzi, as well as Yadvisa, and thank you very much for engaging in this topic. We'll have to bring you back because obviously, clearly, there are still a number of issues there that are left unanswered and unchallenged. So it's a conversation that we'll need to continue. But I appreciate your time this evening. Now.